comes from the south. He's coming toward us now. Now we're observing what appears to be a beam coming down to the ground. This is unreal. 3:30, or 03:30, and the objects are still in the sky, although the one to the south looks like it's losing a little bit of altitude. We're turning around and heading back toward the base. The object to the south is still beaming down lights to the ground. 400 hours, one object still hovering over Woodbridge Base at about 5 to 10 degrees off the horizon, still moving erratic and similar lights and beaming down this area.
What you just listened to was an excerpt from the actual recording from Lieutenant Colonel James Holt describing what he was witnessing in the second of 2 UFO encounters in Rendlesham Forest. This incident was witnessed by a group of United States servicemen stationed at RAF Woodbridge in the United Kingdom. This was later confirmed when military documents about this event were released to the public following a Freedom of Information Act request. Going over this story, I couldn't help but notice how perfect it was. Like, too perfect. Textbook perfect. MUFON field guide perfect. It's like the litmus test for the Hynek scale. J. Allen Hynek devised a 6-fold classification method for organizing UFO encounters: nocturnal lights, or lights in the sky; daylight discs, UFOs seen in the daytime; radar visual, UFOs with radar confirmation; close encounters of the first kind, visual sightings of an unidentified flying object; close encounters of the second kind, an event where a physical interaction is alleged, for example, a craft landing; close encounters of the third kind, encounters where an animated entity is present, or a being exits from a UFO. And those 6 categories were expanded upon by other UFO researchers in later years. Close encounters of the fourth kind, an event where a human is abducted by a UFO or its occupants. Jacques Vallée argued that this should include cases when witnesses experienced a transformation in their sense of reality. Close encounters of the fifth kind, direct communication between humans and aliens. Close encounters of the sixth kind, death of a human or animal associated with a UFO encounter. And close encounters of the seventh kind, the creation of a human-alien hybrid. You probably recognize some of these terms from the 1977 Spielberg film that popularized them, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I want you to keep these in mind for the rest of the video. So I like to think of Rendlesham Forest as a Christmas story, the same way that Die Hard is a Christmas story. On the 26th of December, 1980, in the darkness of night, a security patrol near the east gate of RAF Woodbridge saw strange lights fly over them and then descend into Rendlesham Forest. The witnesses didn't realize this yet, but at the same time, radar operators at RAF Neatishead, a radar defense station operated by the Royal Air Force, also detected an unidentified flying object on their radar screen. This caused a panic in their control room. The object did not respond to any attempts of communication and outperformed the capabilities of any existing RAF aircraft. At RAF Watton, a civilian radar operator named David Potts claimed he tracked an unidentified object across the North Sea. Apparently, this was a common occurrence, so at the time he shrugged it off as a technical malfunction. We have to remember that this is 1980, the tail end of the Cold War. The 1979 Russian invasion of Afghanistan saw a major change in Western foreign policy towards Russia. Tensions between the West and the USSR were on their way to reaching heights not seen since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This sharp increase in hostility and paranoia kept military bases by the North Sea on high alert. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston was the on-duty flight chief chief at Woodbridge Base, enjoying a midnight snack, when he received a phone call that Airman First Class Cabansang was on his way to pick him up. He was then instructed he was to meet up with 2 military police officers, Staff Sergeant Bud Steffen and Airman First Class John Burroughs. The 2 military police officers told Peniston a bizarre story about seeing lights in the forest and believed they might have a problem. Peniston implored that they should all go investigate the lights, thinking it could possibly be a downed aircraft. But Staff Sergeant Steffens rejected that, insisting it couldn't have been a crash, as he believed that he already witnessed it landing. Confused by this report, Bud Steffens didn't want to join the others in investigating the lights. He was shaken up by the initial sighting and refused to go. Upon entering the forest, they saw a bright light shining through the trees. The terrain became too difficult for their vehicle, so they had to proceed the rest of the way on foot. Peniston noticed that the animals in the forest were whipped into a frenzy, and radio communications began to fail, so he ordered Cabansang to go back to the vehicle and for Burroughs to stay at the tree line to maintain communications. But Burroughs, frozen in fear, failed to acknowledge the order, and so communications with the base were lost. Peniston edged closer to the vehicle, noting an electrical charge in the air that made his hair stand on end. He was able to make out something metallic on the ground, describing it as a smooth, shiny black triangular object, 3 meters wide and 2 meters tall. White light was emitting from the top and the bottom of the object, with banks of red and blue lights flashing alternately on either side. Peniston took out a camera and took an entire roll's worth of photos. He reached out and touched the craft, noting that it was warm despite the cold winter weather. Sliding his hand across the surface, he felt areas he described as hieroglyphs, claiming that they felt like sandpaper. Upon doing this, he lost his orientation. Everything became a brilliant white, and he could no longer see or hear. Before he knew it, he was back standing next to the craft, facing the glyphs. The object began turning a vivid white light color, making Peniston believe it was about to explode. It rose 4 feet into the air, maneuvered through the trees, then disappeared in the blink of an eye. Okay, at this point we can tick off like 5 of the 6 different encounters on the Hynek scale. I don't know if we can count daytime discs though, because this was a nighttime sighting. We have credible, sensible witnesses on duty, presumably not under the influence of drugs or alcohol that would impair their judgment. Multiple people witnessing this phenomenon from different angles, including radar images and photographs, including somebody who reached out and touched the craft. Already, this sounds like a pretty convincing case on that merit alone. If you're enjoying this episode so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and click that notification bell so you never miss another episode. And if you really love this channel, please consider pledging to my Patreon. Your support is greatly appreciated. My lovely patrons make my weekly uploads possible. Thank you all so much. When the airmen returned to the base after this encounter, they were debriefed and instructed to forget everything they had seen that night. The following day, the deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Halt, who had been away for Christmas, heard about this incident and summoned Ed Cabansang to his office to relay to him his version of events. Skeptical of the story, Colonel Halt didn't have to wait long to find out that the men were in fact telling the truth, as later that night he was informed while attending a party that the UFO had returned. It's actually because of Lieutenant Colonel Halt that this case became such a well-known incident at all. He wrote a memorandum to the Ministry of Defense at the behest of the British base commander, Squadron Leader Donald Morland. It found its way into the public domain after an American UFO research group used the Freedom of Information Act in 1983 to have it declassified. This is one of only 2 pieces of solid evidence that we have for this event. Halt assembled a team of men with the intent of exposing the whole charade as a hoax, but what he discovered instead was something straight out of a Spielberg movie.
When Colonel Halt arrived to investigate the new UFO sighting, he found the forest scattered with personnel already. Men running all over the place with vehicles, with their lighting malfunctioning. At the original landing site, he saw a glowing red object moving through the trees, describing it as circular, like a large eye with an iris, winking at him.
Halt had activated a miniature recorder, taping commentary of the entire ordeal.
Then a second craft arrived above their heads at amazing speed, hovered above them, and then projected down a beam of light only 3 feet away from where they were standing.
Okay, it's one thing to hear one serviceman's account of witnessing a UFO, even reaching out and touching it. I can see reason to doubt that. But to then have that story backed up and corroborated by a senior ranking officer who claims to witness a UFO hovering over him, sending beams of light down next to him, only 3 feet away?
The UFO then started flying over the ordnance facilities, continuing to shoot beams of light into some of the storage areas, like it was scanning them. I found interviews where witnesses claimed that one of these craft landed on the ground, and 3 little men got out.
At that point, we saw people, or whatever you want to call them, coming out. They didn't come out. There were no doors or anything on this ship. These things moved out. There were 3 of them, and they were covered with, they had light around them. They came out, they stood there, and they actually floated to make it more complicated.
I struggle with this story because I'm very skeptical of UFO reports. I find it hard to believe that UFOs exist as physical objects at all. And to hear such bold claims made by the military is troubling. Peniston and Burroughs were granted 6 days leave after their experience, and after the debriefing, Peniston realized that the military was probably going to erase all of the evidence of the encounter. So the next morning, he went out to the woods to make plaster casts of the indentations left in the ground by the craft.
Back in his room, Staff Sergeant Peniston was seeing a series of 1s and 0s being projected into his mind's eye. He wrote it all down in his notebook, along with drawings of the hieroglyphs that he saw on the craft. And upon completion, the images of the binary code stopped appearing to him. It wasn't until the year 2010 that Jim Peniston realized what he had written. It was, in fact, binary code.
Remember how the radar operators at RAF Neatishead and RAF Watton both witnessed unidentified objects on their radar screens that night and morning? Well, the tapes from both bases were requisitioned 3 days later. In fact, plain-clothes officers with American accents arrived at RAF Watton to requisition the copies. David Potts, a civilian operator, didn't know for sure, but he thought that they must have been OSI or NSA since they had the necessary clearances.
Most bizarrely, these normally secretive and elusive figures freely volunteered to the members of the base that the anomalies weren't technical malfunctions, but were, in fact, metallic UFOs seen near a large Air Force base in East Anglia.
Peniston was interviewed by Air Force OSI agents days after the encounter, likely the same people who David Potts was talking about.
Apparently, these agents asked if they could inject Peniston with sodium pentothal, a truth serum, in order to extract information from him about what he had witnessed that night. An experience that disturbed him so much, he later suffered from nightmares and eventually was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Oh yeah, I almost forgot. When Peniston went in to request the photos that he had taken, he was told that the film was fogged and useless, and they refused to release copies to him. Of course. But only a few days after the incident, Lieutenant General Charles A. Gabriel, the Supreme Commander for the United States Air Force in Europe, personally arrived at Woodbridge Base and was handed taped evidence. And I'm betting that that included the photos of the UFO. On the third day after Lieutenant Colonel Holt's personal encounter, he sent a team with Geiger counters out to where Peniston had witnessed the phenomenon, and they found that some of the areas were radioactive. The radiation readings, Peniston's famous encounter, and Holt's tape were the basis for the memorandum that, once released in 1983, catapulted this story into the UFO zeitgeist.
Lieutenant Colonel Holt, confined by security oaths, refuses to disclose if the storage areas that the UFOs had been seen beaming lights into contained nuclear weapons or not. But during the Cold War, there were multiple accounts of UFOs harassing and tampering with nuclear weapons facilities.
So can you see why I find this story so boring? Everything is so perfectly packaged into this textbook Hollywood movie UFO experience. It literally has everything short of a cattle mutilation and alien-human hybrids. It even has Men in Black-like characters that use truth serum.
And that is why I mentioned the Hynek scale, because it was like someone used it as a guide to frame the whole event as a definitive example of the quintessential UFO story.
I've said before that what makes stories like this interesting is the intrigue, the drama, the suspense, and the mystery. This story doesn't have any of that. It's ridiculously sterile and matter-of-fact.
It's all too perfect. I'm bored even talking about it. Give me something ambiguous with grand claims and no corroborating evidence any day over a case like this that made me question my state of reality and the very nature of the universe. The Men in Black figures freely divulging to everyone that they saw metallic flying discs. The interviews with the ex-servicemen describing in great detail something that they should have been ordered to keep secret. And the Freedom of Information Act request. It's amazing that the military complied to that, despite the case only being 3 years old at that point, when they should have been able to wait 50 years to release that memorandum. Why?
The story is crafted, it feels fake, and the weirdest part is that despite how solid the evidence is for this story, almost nobody seems to care about it. Well, that's it for me this week. That's the boring story of the Rendlesham Forest UFO. Let me know what you guys think about this story in the comments section below. Just like Mothman, I'm gonna say this was probably a military psyop to cover up some sort of secret technology. And until next time, make sure to subscribe to my second channel, Armored Gregory, where I respond to my favorite comments. Like the comments from last week's video on the Coravina incident. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. Binary.